Mm, Muy buenas tardes. Sean todos bienvenidos al Seminario de Investigación y Control de Cáncer, seminario del Instituto Nacional de Salud Pública. El día de hoy tenemos la participación de la doctora Kimberly Bertrand. Ella es profesora de medicina en el Centro de Epidemiología Sloan en la Universidad de Boston. Es una epidemióloga de cáncer que se ha fundamentalmente dedicado a la etiología de cáncer de mama y entendiendo el cáncer de mama en distintos grupos sociales en Estados Unidos. Actualmente ella es parte del equipo de investigadores principales del Black Women's Health Study, que es una corte prospectiva de casi 60,000 mujeres que se autoidentifican como mujeres de raza negra, que inició en 1995. Entonces, muchísimas gracias, doctora Bertrand. La doctora Bertrand, también quiero decir, es una vieja amiga de nuestra institución. Ella vino hace bastantes años y de hecho colaboró en trabajar con el estudio de salud de las maestras aquí en México. Estuvo trabajando un verano aquí con nosotros. Entonces, es un gran gusto y es un gran honor tenerla de vuelta. Doctora Bertrand, thank you very much for being here. It's really an honor and a pleasure to have you here and to listen to the work that you have been doing over the past several years. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lejeune. I understood some of what you said in the intro. I recognized some words, which was very lovely. Thank you for the warm welcome. So I'll go ahead and share my screen now, and I tested this earlier. How does this look to you guys? Pretty good? Okay.
Good,
awesome.
yes.
Okay, so today I'm really looking forward to having some discussion afterwards, hopefully, but I want to talk to you about the Black Women's Health Study. And my presentation is in 3 parts. Sorry, let me move forward. The first is I want to show you the motivation and the overview of the Black Women's Health Study. I think you'll find that it's quite similar in study design to the Mexican teachers cohort that my team talked about. The second part, I'll just highlight some recent research highlights from our study that I think that you will find hopefully interesting. And then the third part, I'll just go into like a small case study of some research I led within the Black Women's Health Study on cancer risk in women. So moving along, I'm going to start here, which is some graphs about racial disparities in disease. And specifically what I'm starting with is the increased burden of disease, especially of cancer, in Black people in the United States. So what I'm showing here is data from the SEER Cancer Registries. It's the Surveillance, Epidemiology, and End Results Program. It's meant to be a nationwide survey of cancer. And these are mortality rates that's compared between Black women in the red bars and white women in the blue bars. And what you can see is that for breast cancer, Black women are 40% more likely to die from their disease compared to white women. And this mortality difference in Black and white women has persisted for many years, 20 years, more than that probably. You see even worse disparities for uterine cancer, which is also called endometrial cancer, so cancer of the womb. Black women are twice as likely to die from their disease. And it's not just cancers where we see these glaring disparities, but for example, in cardiovascular disease, Black women are much more likely to die from cardiovascular disease compared to white women. So I just picked these diseases as some motivation, but what is underlying these risks in these groups? Why do Black women have higher risks of death from these diseases? So in the United States, due to the legacy of racism, Black women and men, but I study Black women, disproportionately face social, economic, and environmental burdens, as well as structural racism, which may contribute to the higher burden of these diseases. So although what I'm showing you in this graph is contemporary rates of death from these diseases, these shocking and glaring racial disparities in disease burden have been recognized in the United States for a very long time. So the Black Women's Health Study was begun in 1995, and the original principal investigators of the study were Lynn Rosenberg and Julie Palmer, who are both still involved in the study today. I've recently become one of the PIs along with Yvette Cozier, and Julie Palmer is the contact PI. Since 1995, we have been continuously funded by the US National Cancer Institute. We are fingers crossed for continued funding in the current administration. But you know, this study was started at a time where there were very, very few studies that included Black women or Black men for that matter. And even at this point, some large cohorts of white women had been started, but there was really very few studies of women's health that included Black women. And so you might ask, and I think I asked when I joined this study, why did the investigators choose to enroll only Black women in this study? Why not a more diverse cohort, for example, right? You probably get this question a lot in the Mexican teachers cohort. Well, first of all, representation matters. So even today, more than 75% of participants in clinical cancer research studies are non-Hispanic white. In the US, only about 60% of the population is non-Hispanic white. So you have this overrepresentation of the majority population in research studies of cancer. But what really matters is that to understand the drivers of these health disparities, it's my belief that we really need to study the populations that are affected, that have the higher burden of these diseases. And despite increased interest in enrolling diverse populations in recent years, maybe not this year, this is still the case. The fact that we have diverse cohorts, we have clinical trials that attempt to enroll racial minorities, but they still don't make the cut. And so why wouldn't we choose, why in 1995, why didn't the investigators choose to enroll a racially diverse cohort? And the reason really has to do with generalizability and statistical power. So I think when the investigators first wrote this research proposal to establish this cohort of Black women, some of the reviewers said, well, why don't you do half Black women and half white women? Because what we really want to know is what are the differences between Black and white women. But in fact, when you cut the population in half, now you have half the statistical power to be able to precisely look at associations of risk factors with disease, right? So you really get more bang for your buck by enrolling an exclusive cohort of Black women. And that's what the investigators argued back there. And now we are among the largest studies, actually the largest study of Black women in the United States to date. And that enables us to have the statistical power and accrue the cancer case numbers that we need for robust analyses of risk factor associations. The other piece of it, and really important in my mind, is that Black women in this country have unique experiences and exposures. So some of these exposures and experiences may not actually extend to other populations in the United States. So I'll go into this in the next slide. But the fact is that they experience these unique exposures, these unique experiences that may not be observable in white populations. And what we know, and what I know that you know, is that race is a social construct and a political construct, of course. There's very little biological basis to race, and yet experiences of being a racial minority in a country like the United States can have physiological consequences. So, for example, in previous studies that looked at diverse groups, and still today, race is often considered the exposure of interest, right? So we're comparing disease rates in Black women versus white women. But I think we need to go beyond describing health disparities and considering white women or white men as the reference group, where we can really understand exactly what is happening within the group of Black women or men. So failure to include sufficient numbers of Black women really limits our opportunity to study the full range of exposures that may be experienced. And some of them, as examples, are we have ancestry, which is highly linked to race, but it's not race is not only determined by by ancestry. But what you have is people in the world experience their neighborhoods differently. Black women are obviously more exposed to interpersonal, institutional, and structural racism, not something you can study in a cohort of white women. They are less likely to have achieved higher educational attainment, have lower incomes compared to white women. These socioeconomic factors can affect their risk of disease and also their access to care, for example. And an example that I want to give is that they also live in different types of neighborhoods. So in the US, because of the legacy of historical mortgage lending practices, those historical mortgage lending practices continue to shape neighborhood inequities today. So Black women and men at all income and education levels are more likely to live in disadvantaged neighborhoods, compared to their white counterparts. And these are neighborhoods that are characterized by, for example, more violence, more pollution because they're closer to roadways, for example, or they're closer to factories, and just more overall stress, less resources, and things like that. So we have racism, we have individual level socioeconomic factors, we have neighborhood factors, and we'll get into the case study. We have other experiences too that may differ. So going back to the study design of the Black Women's Health Study, I didn't say this before, I did say it's the largest study of Black women to focus on cancer in the United States. In 1995, 59,000 women were enrolled in this cohort. And similar to the Mexican teachers cohort, it's a closed cohort. So we didn't have any new enrollees or new recruitment after 1995. And it was really established to identify the unique risk factors for cancer and now other diseases among Black women that might be the drivers of these racial disparities that are clearly evident in all of the research up until this point. So some of those novel risk factors may include physiological factors, psychosocial factors, geospatial factors, and structural racism, as I mentioned before. I think just sort of a fun fact about the Black Women's Health Study is how women were recruited. I know a lot of you are familiar again with other cohorts like the Mexican teachers cohort. This was a little different. And after a few pilot studies, the investigators opted to reach out to subscribers of a popular fashion magazine in the United States called Essence, which is still on the newsstand today. It's marketed to Black women. So that proved a very effective recruitment strategy. And then also word of mouth, friends and families. We also recruited from some professional organizations like the Black Nurses Society. At baseline, women were ages 21 to 69 with a mean age of 38. Now we're celebrating our 30th year of research. And so now the mean age is around 68. But you can see that at the time the cohort was established, it was relatively young, 38, as the mean age. Most of the cancers that were going to occur hadn't occurred yet as of baseline. So we were really interested in prospective analyses of risk factors with cancer outcomes. We are fortunate to have high response rates. This is really due to the dedication of our research staff. Really just a lot of outreach to our participants. Our participants are proud, loyal members of the study. One thing I didn't mention, which is nice, is that participants come from all over the United States. So we have actually a wide variety, a wide range of different neighborhoods represented and different income levels and different socioeconomic status. So we have all of that to be able to look at. We collect questionnaires every 2 years. The baseline questionnaire, I think, was about 16 pages long. That proved too long going forward. Now we cap it at about 4 pages to make sure our response rates stay high. There are some questions we ask every 2 years, things like smoking and alcohol and exercise, but there are some of the things that we don't have to ask more than once. If you ask somebody about their childhood exposures or childhood experiences, you can just ask that once and you don't need to repeat that. We have very detailed information about reproductive history, and I didn't mention this before, but it also is something to consider. And I'm primarily a breast cancer researcher. in terms of the reproductive the distribution of reproductive factors in Black women historically has been really different than in white women because of the educational differences. So higher education generally is associated with delayed childbearing and fewer numbers of children. So Black women in our study are more likely to have more kids and less likely to breastfeed, for example. So they're just the experience of being a Black woman may change some of the lifestyle, things we call lifestyle risk factors or the reproductive risk factors. So detailed comprehensive history of reproduction, detailed medical history, including medications. And as I mentioned before, one of the unique sort of powers of the Black Women's Health Study is the ability to study these psychosocial factors. So to actually directly measure and assess experiences of racism among the people in our study. Let's see, I think one thing to mention is we have moved from a paper questionnaire to a web-based questionnaire. Now about half the participants complete their questionnaire online, which is good for data management and I think easier for a lot of the participants, but some of the older generations still prefers to fill out their surveys on paper. All of our questionnaires are available on our website, which I'll share at the end. So these are all open to look at, so you can see what types of data we've collected. So in addition to questionnaire data, we have a number of data linkages which we make use of in our many studies. So one is we link to cancer registries, and this allows us to confirm any self-reported diagnoses of cancer. It also lets us obtain more detailed information on people's cancer. So women often don't know, for example, what subtype of breast cancer they were diagnosed with, or they may just report lung cancer and they don't tell us like which lung, or there's a lot of information we can glean. We can also glean, for example, stage at diagnosis, which women often don't report. So the cancer registries are useful for that, and we link in the United States. Our cancer registries are state-based, and we link our linkage is to about 24 states out of 50, and it covers about 95% of our participants. Live in states where there are linkages. We are also now recently linking to Medicare data, which is the public insurance program in the United States that's mainly for people 65 and older. Pretty much all people get enrolled in this once they turn 65. This is useful because we don't have registries for some of the disease outcomes we study, like Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease. So we can use those data to confirm self-reported diagnoses of non-cancer outcomes. We can also use Medicare data to look more in depth at like treatment. So one of the spaces we're moving into, in addition to etiologic research, meaning research on the causes of cancer, we're also interested in the factors that lead to mortality from cancer, or better survivorship, I should say, the opposite. So quality of life. So now that we have so many cancer survivors in the United States, what are those factors that improve their lives as cancer survivors? So we're able to look at how treatment might affect those associations. Another thing is that we link to United States Census data, which allows us to sort of capture different elements of neighborhoods that people live in. So this allows us to tell whether somebody is living in a neighborhood with a lot of resources, like a wealthy neighborhood, or a less wealthy neighborhood. And this has important implications for not only their disease risk, but their, for example, their ability to access fresh fruits and vegetables, for example, or fast food places. Is there a community dominated by fast food or dominated by Whole Foods or grocery stores that are healthy? But also, what are the resources available in those communities? What is the education like in those communities? So we can use these census data to look not just at individual markers of socioeconomic status, but what it looks like in their greater, where they live in the world. Important in the United States is this looking at residential segregation, for example. So even though slavery is long gone, these historical lending practices still mean that there are cities and areas of our country that are racially segregated. So you might have a neighborhood, for example, in Boston, where it's predominantly Black, and you have another neighborhood that's predominantly white. So looking at those measures is important too for understanding the factors associated with disease. And then more recently, we're looking at the built environment too. So this might be things like walkability or proximity to green spaces like parks, or safe recreation like bike paths or things like that. So we can use these geospatial data because we have geocoded every participant address since 1995. So which geocoding means that we have pinpointed their exact residential location according to the latitude and longitude, so on a map. So we can measure like factors associated with the neighborhood in which they live. And finally, we can directly link to environmental data from, like, for example, from the Environmental Protection Agency, where we can actually use these geocoded addresses to link to exposures to ambient air pollution, for example, or major roadways, or proximity to dioxin emitting factories and plants. So, beyond the questionnaire data, there's a lot we can do with these data linkages, and I'm sure I've missed some, but those are the major ones that I thought of. And in terms of medical data, we also have, we collect medical records from everybody. So in addition to the cancer registry, we ask women with cancers and other major diseases like cardiovascular disease or diabetes for permission to look at their medical records. And this helps us pinpoint sort of, what was your date of diagnosis? Is this confirmed by a doctor? We can deal with misclassification or misreporting of a diagnosis this way. So this is, because this study is all participant driven, we're not linked with any major clinical network. So these are not electronic medical records. We have to go out and ask people's doctors individually for their medical records. But they've been proven really useful. We also have a pretty robust biorepository. So from about half the cohort, we've collected saliva samples, which are used as a source of DNA for genomic studies, but also as a source of to measure the oral microbiome, which is becoming of interest in cancer etiology recently. Blood samples is a little bit more invasive to collect than saliva samples. So we have blood samples from about 13,000 women in the cohort, about 25% of the surviving cohort. We collected these in the around 2014 to 2018. And again, we use them as a source of DNA, but we've also measured vitamin D and HbA1c, which is the marker for diabetes and inflammation, on all of the blood samples that we collected. And these are archived, and I'm using some of these blood samples in some of my research to look at pre-diagnostic conditions, for example, or biomarkers of disease. And then finally, we have some tumor tissue. This is most robust for our breast cancer tumor tissue collection, but this allows us to look at molecular features of tumors and to look at etiologic heterogeneity by subtypes. Oh yeah, I forgot about the mammogram repository. How could I forget? Okay, so we also have digital mammograms collected from about 10,000 women in the cohort, including about 500 or 600 women with a history of breast cancer. These are the pre-diagnostic mammograms, so they're screening mammograms from before they got cancer, and then from non-cases as well. Okay, so I don't see any questions, so I'll save questions for the end, but I wanted to share with you like sort of just the vast amount of resources that are available in the cohort, and how much effort it takes to do that, and how dedicated our participants are for providing all of this. Okay, so the next part, I want to talk to you a little bit. I just want to give you some highlights, some overviews of some recent research highlights and current projects. And here I'm really focusing on what have we been able to look at in terms of risk factors for cancer that's specific to Black women. So these are studies that, in my opinion, couldn't have been done in a diverse cohort or in a white, a cohort full predominantly of white women. So one of the more recent research findings is validation and development of breast cancer risk prediction models. And I don't actually know if these are used in Mexico at all, but in the United States, there are these clinical breast cancer risk prediction models that are used by doctors to estimate a woman's future risk of breast cancer. And these typically include a couple of variables, like based on their medical, reproductive, and family history. And that helps both patients and clinicians help decide, potential screening structures. So, how often should a woman get her mammogram? Or, does she have such a high risk that she should consider, other interventions? Or there's something in the chat checking. Or if there's eligibility for like chemopreventive clinical trials, for example. So these models are used clinically to predict risk. But the thing is that the models that are commonly used today, at least in the US, are based predominantly on data from white women. And it turns out they don't perform as well in Black women. And part of that may be because of differences in risk factor associations. So one example that I'll give you is, I mentioned earlier, differences in reproductive patterns. So for breast cancer, having more children typically associated with a decreased risk of ER positive breast cancer. So having more kids is sort of like a protective effect on breast cancer. This is actually not true for ER negative breast cancer, which is more common in Black women than in white women. So for ER negative cancer, having more kids increases your risk of ER negative cancer. So the problem is looking at breast cancer as a whole, maybe obscuring some of these unique differences in risk factor associations by subtype, which also extends to by race. So the Black Women's Health Study, in a project led by Dr. Palmer, developed a new breast cancer risk prediction tool that showed better performance over the existing models in non-Hispanic white women. And in particular, this model was especially well performing in younger women, especially those under 40 who may not have been recommended for screening yet. So if we can apply these new models to women who are younger, we may be able to make clinical decisions about, why don't you start your mammography screening maybe at an earlier age because you happen to be at a high risk, as evidenced by this model. In a follow-up to this study, we also showed that adding polygenic risk scores to this model improved model fit even better. So the results of models like this can help clinicians and women make personalized decisions about when to begin screening, how often to screen, whether to do supplemental screening. And the model that was developed with data from the Black Women's Health Study and some other cohorts that had numbers of Black women showed that this model may perform better. We're also looking at, not moving, sorry. We're also looking now at new artificial intelligence-based models, which look specifically only at mammogram images to predict future risk of breast cancer. There are some open source models now on the available, developed by researchers. And again, these recent advances in artificial intelligence are really exciting because they may actually improve model performance even better than the questionnaire-based models, the models based on personal risk factors. And that's what the data showed to date. However, they haven't been sufficiently tested in Black women. And so I'm working with a collaborator at Columbia to see how well these newly developed models perform in Black women. And again, this is where the mammograms that we collected come in. And so far, we actually see better performance on, these are unpublished data, but we see better performance looking at just mammograms, just the image of the mammogram itself, years before cancer diagnosis. There's something about the tool, the artificial intelligence deep learning model, that can predict who is at risk of developing cancer in the next 5 years, for example. So these models may act synergistically with some of the risk factor-based models, or maybe even perform better. But it's really important that we validate these open source models in Black women, because if we don't, the AI tools that are really exciting could potentially lead to increasing disparities in outcomes. A couple of other examples are, I talked to you about neighborhood and how Black women are more likely to live in disadvantaged neighborhoods. And this could be anything from living closer to roadways, living closer, having more air pollution, living in areas that are noisy or have violence and there's more stress. And so in a couple of research studies, my colleagues have shown that living in disadvantaged neighborhoods, so lower income, lower resource neighborhoods, is associated with a 25% increased risk of an aggressive form of breast cancer called ER-negative breast cancer, and also a 50% increased risk of breast cancer death. And importantly, what I think is scary about this association is that this is even after adjustment for individual level socioeconomic status. So after adjusting for a person's, for example, insurance status or her own education or her own income, you still see that just living here is increasing risk somehow. And it remains to be seen, disentangling what are those contextual factors that are really driving those risks. But this would be, again, a study that would be difficult to do in a population that only lives in affluent areas, for example. And we've seen this association of neighborhood disadvantage with other cancers as well, including lung cancer and more recently multiple myeloma, suggesting that better understanding of neighborhoods is going to be important for understanding health and disease risk going forward. When we look at specific reports of racism, so in the Black Women's Health Study, we asked women how frequently or whether they had ever experienced racism on the job or in applying for a mortgage or for rent, so in housing or with the police. And women who reported having experiences like this had a 16% increased risk of diabetes, 26% increased risk of coronary heart disease, and a 38% increased risk of stroke. So when I said at the very beginning that race has often been used as a proxy for racism, but it's not a perfect proxy, right? And we're able in the Black Women's Health Study to study racism as a metric itself. And when I say that race is not a biological construct, the effects of racism do have biological consequences. So we think that these associations are likely driven by physiological changes in like inflammation, for example. That might be one of the mechanisms there. So there's stress on the body, which leads to increased risk of disease. We've also shown that these neighborhood level factors and racism are associated with increased risk of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, and also worse cognitive function. We have a couple of new grants. My colleagues have a couple of new grants that are looking at repeated measures of cognitive function over time. So they're actually doing annual measures of cognitive health and memory and that kind of thing by repeated cognitive assessments. And they're also looking at biomarkers using the blood archives that I mentioned to try to disentangle like what are the mechanisms of these associations, what are the physiological mechanisms that lead to where you live impacts your health, and is there something within the body that we can detect and sort of explain some of these mechanisms. We also are looking at structural racism as a different metric, different than neighborhood disadvantage. So those are some ongoing studies too. So another research highlight is chemical hair relaxers. And this is actually where I'm going to spend the case study, so the third and final part of the talk. So chemical hair relaxers are products that are used to straighten naturally curly or tightly coiled hair. And this is an exposure that women experience that is much, much, much more prevalent in Black women in the United States than in white women. They're much more likely to use chemical hair relaxers to straighten their hair, and I'll explain why in a minute. But we have seen in a number of different studies within the Black Women's Health Study that use of chemical hair relaxers is associated with an increased risk of uterine fibroids, potentially an increased risk of ER-positive breast cancer, and an increased risk of uterine cancer. And I'll go into this a little bit more, but this is where I wanted to focus because I think this is an example of a unique exposure that maybe, isn't able to be studied in some of these, cohorts that don't have good representation of Black women. And it might also be, an exposure that many white researchers may not think about, to be honest. So, if you don't experience it, you might not think about it. And so I think it's really important that we in the Black Women's Health Study listen to our participants and understand what it is that they want to know about their health, right? So we actually queried information about women's use of chemical hair relaxers very, very early on in the study, back on the second questionnaire in 1997. So I'll get to that now. Okay, so I'll just take a little breath. Okay, so these are products that are heavily marketed and used by Black women. So why is that? Well, one reason is because of the legacy of racism, again, and discrimination in our country. So in part to conform to US-centric or white-centric beauty standards, women in professional workplaces have been told that their hair is not professional when it's in its natural state. This is historic and also current. I'm sure you can see in the news that this happens still to like athletes, for example. Basketball players, for example, have recently been in the news for this. So the idea that straight hair represents a professional look has been ingrained in the community. And so straighteners were invented to help women straighten their hair to conform to these standards. Now, I also want to say that it's not the only reason women use these products. And I believe that women should have a choice of how they wear their hair, right? And we're very fortunate now. We have we have something in the US called the Crown Act, which is banning discrimination against natural hairstyles, this law has been passed in many states, and I think it's soon to be a federal law. But that's still pretty recent. But another reason people may use these products is because for some women, it makes their hair easier to manage in the mornings. But these products have to be used continuously. So they last maybe 6-7 weeks or so, and then you have to apply them again. So not only are they heavily marketed and used by Black women, they're also very minimally regulated by our Food and Drug Administration, because they are not classified as a food or a drug, but they're classified as a cosmetic. And they contain thousands of potentially toxic ingredients. And there's really currently the manufacturers of these products do not have to prove their safety. They just have to claim their safety. So under the current laws, as I understand it, they just have to say, my products are safe. And there's no sort of double checking. There's no clinical trials, for example, like there would be for medications, for example. And what they're known to contain is actually, some of them contain known carcinogens, like formaldehyde is a known ingredient in some of these products. And you don't really have to see the chart on the right, but what's showing here is an off-the-shelf chemical assessment of various products. And the last 3 columns are different hair relaxers. These chemicals can be found in shampoos and things like that too, but I'll tell you why they're really important for hair relaxers. In addition to formaldehyde and known carcinogens, the other ingredients in these products that I am concerned about are phthalates and parabens, which are part of a chemical class called endocrine disruptors. So these are chemicals that interfere with the normal hormonal function of the body. Back to being minimally regulated is that manufacturers are not required to disclose on their ingredient list that the product contains phthalates and parabens. What you will often see on the ingredient list for these products is you will see fragrance or preservative. So some women just don't even know what they're being exposed to. And if you go to the salon to have a professional relaxing of your hair, then who knows what products you're getting, right? So even women who are doing their best effort to look at the labels on their products, wouldn't necessarily know that there are phthalates and parabens in there. But this off-the-shelf study that I'm citing here is showing that these chemicals are detected in present-day hair relaxers and other personal care products. So we know that these products contain these chemicals, but the exact formulations are proprietary. So we don't necessarily know which products, or they're not required, these manufacturers are not required to disclose what's in there. So why do I care slightly more about chemical hair relaxers than I do about shampoos? Well, one thing is shampoos are used on the hair and then they're rinsed out. Chemical hair relaxers, and maybe there's somebody attending who views these things, but they sit on the scalp for a long time. And their active ingredient is sodium dioxide. There's other ones too, but the main one is sodium dioxide. And this is just, it's not a carcinogen in and of itself, but it's a soap. It's a caustic agent. And what it does is it can create micro tears in the skin and chemical burns, actually. So when you have chemical burns, when you have micro tears, these products can seep into your scalp and into your bloodstream and therefore be distributed to different parts of your body. Whereas I think of like shampoos as like you're rinsing those out, you're not exposed for a long time. I have colleagues here at the Black Women's Health Study who use these products as kids. Often in this community, at least historically, you start using these when you're a teen, and their mom, my colleague Renee, she says her mom would put it on her hair and she'd be like, okay, is it tingling? Okay, then sit there 5 minutes longer and until it burns, and then we'll rinse it off. And so that's disturbing, right? Because now you're creating a pathway for exposure of these chemicals. Okay. So there is evidence from animal and experimental studies that suggest a possible link between chemicals and hair relaxers and risk of cancer. So in particular, experimental and animal studies that look at, tumor development in rats, for example, and being exposed to endocrine disruptors can increase risk. There have been many fewer population-based studies with inconsistent results for breast cancer and only one prior study of uterine cancer. Now, I picked these two cancer types because these are both known to be hormonally driven cancer types. So we think of any chemical exposure that interferes with hormones may be relevant for hormonally driven cancer. So I'm particularly interested here in ER positive breast cancer, estrogen receptor positive breast cancer, and uterine cancer. So there are various different relaxers on the market, but one thing I wanted to say is that this would be difficult to look at in a white population. So in fact, the only other prior study of uterine cancer was conducted in the sister study cohort, which is predominantly a cohort of white women. And what they showed was that, okay, so in the Black Women's Health Study, 95% of our participants have used chemical hair relaxers in the past. In the sister study, which is a more contemporary cohort, 74% of Black women had used chemical hair relaxers. In the white participants, only 3% of non-Hispanic white women had used chemical hair relaxers. So you can see when I said it's disproportionately used by Black women, it's really disproportionate. More than 75% of Black participants have used it compared to 3% of white women. So you really need to be able to study this in a population of Black women. I'll go a little bit faster over this part, but we asked a number of questions in 1997 about, have you ever used a chemical hair relaxer? How old were you when you first used it? How often? For how long, how many years, what type? A lot of women did not know what type. We asked whether people had experienced chemical burns. And what I'm showing you here in the pictures are just some pictures I pulled off the internet. Like these are products on the market today. Like there's products that are even marketed to children, like this one, which are labeled as safer, but they're really not. That they're safer in that they don't contain sodium dioxide. But they're not safer in terms of the other potential toxic chemicals they include. So in the Black Women's Health Study, I mentioned earlier, we have linkage with cancer registries. We also have self-reports of invasive cancer. So these are all confirmed cancer cases. And I will move along there. Our final analytic data set, we had, again, we asked in 1997, so we start follow-up in 1997 and go for 20 years for our breast cancer analysis and 22 years for our uterine cancer analysis. So we wind up with more than 2,300 breast cancer diagnoses over the 20 years of follow-up. And uterine cancer is much rarer, so 347 uterine cancer diagnoses over 22 years of follow-up. I'm going to be just showing you some results from our Cox proportional hazards regression models. These data are all published, so you can go and look at the papers if you're interested, or you can email me and I can send them to you. We adjusted for a number of potential confounders. I will tell you, spoiler alert, none of these really mattered. So I'll just be showing you the results of the fully adjusted analyses. One thing I do want to say is here I'm showing some selected baseline characteristics of our population, stratified by use of chemical hair relaxers. So I mentioned earlier that 95% of Black Women's Health Study participants reported having used chemical hair relaxers in the past. So this left a population of about 5% who had never used chemical hair relaxers. And from a statistical point of view, this was just too small to have like a stable reference group. So I never was really able to compare, heavy users with non-users of these products. So we ended up combining minimal use or a light use category. These are women who've used these products for less than 5 years and less than 3 times a year. And then we defined a heavy use category, which is not an opinion, it's just based on the distribution of the data. About 20% of the participants had used these products for more than 7 times a year and for more than 15 years of duration. So everybody else fell into this middle use moderate category. So we do see, a couple of differences. We see a few differences by BMI. So women who were more likely to use heavy users of chemical hair relaxers were a little bit heavier. There wasn't really a difference in terms of family history of breast cancer. Wasn't really there a difference in terms of educational attainment either, which is why we didn't really see much evidence of confounding at all. So I'm just going to show you some results. They're not really statistically significant. So what I'm plotting here are the associations of hair relaxer use, heavy use compared to never or light use, so infrequent use. I'm showing on the y-axis the hazard ratio and the 95% confidence interval. And this was about 27–30% increased risk of breast cancer, not a statistically significant association. I mentioned I'm particularly interested in the potential endocrine disruptors in these products. So we looked separately by ER status. We have more ER positive cases than ER negative cases. So sort of a similar association as overall, not much different between the two. But what was a little bit more interesting is looking at lye versus no lye relaxers. So lye relaxers are the ones that have the sodium dioxide as the active ingredient, and no lye relaxers have a different active ingredient that may not be as caustic. The no lye relaxers were advertised as being less likely to cause chemical burns. I will tell you in our data, about half the women didn't know what kind they used, and also it was about an equal number who said they had chemical burns regardless of what type they use. I think a lot of women also use, sometimes use lye and sometimes use no lye relaxers. So we still see this like sort of 30% increased risk of ER positive breast cancer for heavy users, especially if they use the lye base. Not quite statistically significant, but the reason I was concerned was that I couldn't get this association to go away no matter what else I adjusted for. So I don't know if more power would have made this statistically significant. But the other important message that I had here was, and I'm not plotting it here, and I'm sorry for that, but we found no increased risk for the moderate users, which I thought was a very reassuring message. Like really, it was very, very similar. The associations were similar to those, and then the never or light users. So it was really only among this 20% and really only about half of them who use these lye-based relaxers that might have been at increased risk of ER positive breast cancer. And this was also seen in the sister study, similar effect size. There's been a couple of case control studies, one in Ghana, which saw no association, another one that showed an association, but only for no lye relaxers. So the data is a little bit difficult to reconcile across the different studies and across how the questions were asked, for example, and also, sort of the years of use. What was marketed in 1997 may not be as relevant as what's on the market today. Although, as I showed you, the current products still have these chemicals in them. So for uterine cancer, I specifically looked at uterine cancer by menopausal status. I will tell you, now I am plotting the moderate users here. So the same sort of classifications, much smaller sample size. So we have much wider confidence intervals. I have barely anybody in the premenopausal range, so I probably shouldn't have even plotted this. But what we see in postmenopausal women, or for postmenopausal women, we actually see about a 50 to 60% increased risk of uterine cancer for both moderate and heavy users of these products, which is concerning. And also, like I said, there's one single prior study, the sister study, which showed a similar effect size in both Black and white women. So, that's two epidemiology studies looking at hair relaxers and uterine cancer risk. But like I said before, we do know that hair relaxer use was also associated with uterine fibroids. And specifically, we also know that the chemicals in there, through experimental evidence, can increase risk of tumors as well. So this is important because it's a potential opportunity for policy decisions, for example, and I'll share a little bit about that. We have a couple of limitations here. I mentioned the lack of a true unexposed reference group. We could also have exposure misclassification, women not reporting, exactly correctly their duration of use or their frequency of use. I didn't show it, but I didn't see many trends. For uterine cancer, I did see a bit of a trend for longer duration of use, more frequency of use was associated with increased risk. But I didn't really see any differences for like earlier age at first use, probably because we didn't have much variation in that. Most women were between 13 and 18 when they first started using these relaxers. I didn't see really any differences, whether, regardless of whether women reported having chemical burns or not. And then another limitation is that right now, we haven't updated hair relaxer use over time. So I just have this one baseline or this one exposure assessment in 1997. I will tell you on our 2024 questionnaire, 2024-2025, which is still in progress, we have updated these questions. So we're now looking at, we'll be looking at whether women are still using hair relaxers. And importantly, what I care about is whether if you stop using hair relaxers, does your risk go back down? I'm going to skip the summary because that's, what I just said. So what I was talking about with policy is that in 2023, at the end of 2023, when the results of the sister study came out, and then the results of the Black Women's Health Study sort of corroborated those results, a couple of congresspeople in the U.S. wrote to the FDA and sort of demanded that the FDA start looking into these products. And the FDA proposed a ban on certain chemicals in hair relaxers. And unfortunately, it was the ban was delayed. And I think with the current administration, the latest I've read is that it's sort of been quietly, taken off the table. But I think that there is sort of a grassroots community effort to, at least have more transparent ingredient labeling, for example. And also, I'm really interested in whether, alternatives to these products can be found, because like I said, women still deserve the right to wear their hair however they want, but are there safer alternatives that can be made? So I'm going to end there and just give you a little picture. This is a group of participants from several years ago. So I'm really just giving a shout out to the staff and the participants. Actually, this photo is 10 years old. These are a group of participants in Chicago who were congregating for a higher education conference, and what they're holding in their hand is their 25th anniversary certificate of being a participant in the Black Women's Health Study. They're all smiles because they're very proud to be in this study. And here's my email address and our website, as I promised, where all of our questionnaires can be found and our research highlights. And I think I was supposed to leave more time for questions, but there we are.
Thank you so much, Kim. This is great. I was gonna sort of comment a little bit, but I think that a lot of the things that we're going to talk about, I think you addressed. I'm just gonna, just add some very specific questions that we've been getting. So one of them is whether you have looked at other personal care products or cosmetics, and what importance do you think they have, or do you think that there may be some correlation between the use of those and the use of the hair straightening products?
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually haven't asked about other personal care products. I think one of the challenges, even in asking about chemical hair relaxers, is just the sheer number of products on the market and like the different brands and the fact that the formulations are proprietary. And I think that's why those questions haven't been asked before. It also, I think there's just a little bit of like competition in terms of like, how much can you fit on one questionnaire? What are the most important questions to ask? So we did do on the online, I think we did a supplemental questionnaire that in 2009, or it might have been 2011, where we asked a subset of the women about some other products they use, like hair lotions and hair oils and different, but I think that was more focused on hair. We asked about like whether you wear your hair in braids and stuff. So there is a couple of papers on that, but to my knowledge, we have not asked about other personal care products. So there probably is a correlation.
Again, the other interesting, question is, this study is, looking at a specific population. So could you comment a little bit about how then, the studying in specific populations can then add to the general understanding of cancer etiology, more at a global sort of scale? Because one of the things that we're always concerned, when we work in the Mexican teachers cohort, is how is this? This is clearly very relevant for our population, but how do we advocate for the usefulness and of a more global of these studies to a more global understanding of cancer risk?
Yeah, that's such an important question, and I feel like it's a little bit two-sided, because I sort of feel like we get the same thing. Like, why should we care about this in other countries, right? Like, and Black women in other countries don't have the same experiences of racism and other exposures and experiences that U.S. Black women have, right? So that's an issue. I can think of two good examples. One is when the prevalence of a disease is higher in like a community like the Black Women's Health Study. And I alluded to this earlier with the idea of looking at the differential associations by subtypes of breast cancer. So the Black Women's Health Study was one of the first studies to actually show that parity, or having more children, was associated with an increased risk of ER-negative breast cancer, because about 30% of breast cancers in Black women are ER-negative, but only about 10 to 15% in white women are ER-negative. That said, white women do still experience ER-negative breast cancer, but that association was never able to be shown because they didn't have the same statistical power to look at those ER-negative breast cancers. Another example is I study multiple myeloma as well, which is a blood cancer, and I specifically study the precursor condition called MGUS, monoclonal gammopathy of undetermined significance. Both of these are much, much more common in Black populations and are rare, so they'd be hard to study in white populations, but white populations get these diseases too. So when you can look at a population that has a higher burden of disease, you can look at risk factors that affect everybody. And in fact, for multiple myeloma, for example, one of the highest groups at increased risk is like veterans who've been exposed to like Agent Orange, for example. So that's hard to study in a population that doesn't get the disease that much, right? So those are my initial thoughts.
And that's an excellent wrap up for this, for the original question that we wanted to address. So thank you so much, Kim, for your participation in this seminar. We really are thankful. I think this is very, very useful as we think about as we think about the Mexican teachers cohort or the development of other cohorts in Mexico. I think learning from your experience is awesome. I do think that there's a lot of questions that that we haven't, that we would like to address. So we would it would be great to have you present some other time in the future, because there's a lot to learn from all this experience that you've gathered. And thank you so much. This has been great.
Yeah.
And
Thank you. I'm sorry I didn't leave more time for questions. I got excited talking about it, but I see there's some questions in the chat. So you have feel free to circulate my email address. I'm happy to talk with people. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to speak to your group.
Thank you so much. This is
okay.
Amazing. Thank you. Muchísimas gracias a todo el mundo. Nos vemos el próximo mes. El día 3 de octubre tendremos, no, me parece que es, bueno, el primer miércoles de octubre tendremos el siguiente seminario. Muchísimas gracias a todo el mundo. Estamos en contacto. Gracias.